issues in the West, how the region, trends in the region, and different threads that tie the West together as a region. So I'll pass it off to Manny, and you can go in on introducing everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia, and my apologies for everyone. Even after a couple years of living in this space, still there's always something that catches you off guard. I'm Manny Kowalin. I am the executive director for Inspire Washington. I am a Filipino American male. I have dark hair and brown skin and dark glasses. I have facial hair, a goatee, and I'm wearing a blue checkered shirt. And I'm zooming in from Seattle, Washington, within the land of the Duwamish people here within King County. And I'll pass it over to Lauren.
Which one, Manny?
Oh, Lauren Bogart.
I can go for it. Hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Cloward. I'm a policy advisor with the Western Governors Association, and I manage our cybersecurity, healthcare, and broadband portfolios, as well as a project for the Western Governors Foundation. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm a white woman with long brown hair and glasses, light colored glasses, and wearing a green sweater. And today I'm joining from Denver, Colorado, the ancestral lands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples.
Thank you. And let's pass it over to Timothy.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Wilson, Executive Director of Western Arts Alliance, and I am a white man wearing glasses and short dark brown hair with increasing forehead day by day. And I'm coming to you from the land of the Clackamas, the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, the Cathlamet, the Molalla, and the Multnomah, here at the intersection and the confluence of two great rivers that brought together many nations.
Thank you, Timothy. And Lauren Cloward.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren Bogard. I'm the Director of Campaigns and Special Projects at the Center for Western Priorities, based in Denver, Colorado. And my pronouns are she, her. I had a little bit longer intro comments to explain why land conservation is joining you here this morning, but I'm happy to just leave it there and get into that once we start our conversation, if that's preferred.
Well, fantastic. I mean, this is a great time for us to jump in the conversation. Specifically, just to kind of orient people to everyone's work, how does your organization define the West or the constituency you serve? And can you speak to the priorities of your constituency? Would you like to start that off, Lauren? And anything else you'd like to share in regards to your work in the West?
Sure. So I'll just share a brief overview of the Center for Western Priorities. We're a nonpartisan public lands advocacy organization based here in Denver. So one of the things we do is advocate for responsible conservation and energy practices, and also serve as a source for accurate information and analysis regarding efforts to protect land, water, and communities in the West. And one of the things that we strive to do at CWP is celebrate the enduring connections to the land of the people who live here in the Western US, from the indigenous people who trace their ancestry to this area long before anyone else, as well as the relative newcomers like myself who value the great weather and the open and accessible landscapes for solitude, scenery, wildlife, and of course, outdoor recreation. So I just want to say that speaking with you all today is a good reminder for me of what a privilege it is to live here and work on these issues, and also a reminder to respectfully and humbly acknowledge the original inhabitants and caretakers of this region. In terms of how we approach the question of defining the West for ourselves, we take a regional approach and cover the Rocky Mountain West, which includes the four corner states of Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, as well as Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, and Nevada. So that brings up the question, why those states? Well, in our minds, there are a lot of shared characteristics in terms of the environment, the geology, geography, as well as some of the threats facing the region: climate, drought, wildfire, mineral and oil and gas development. So by taking a regional approach, we're able to compare and contrast what's going on in individual states and across that region, which can be helpful. Sometimes it's motivating to see what your neighbor is doing. We just released a report called Conservation Gridlock, where we looked at how much land has been conserved in 11 Western states over the last 10 years. So sometimes knowing that another state is doing better is a helpful motivator. So I'll stop there and turn it over to one of the other panelists.
Thank you, Lauren. Who would like to take the West?
I can go next, Manny.
Yeah.
Great. So the Western Governors Association defines the West in a little bit of a broader sense. Our footprint is the 19 westernmost states and the 3 Pacific territories. So we go as far east as both North and South Dakota and Oklahoma, and then west from there. So as Lauren mentioned, there's a lot of similar characteristics to these states: a lot of federal land, vast distances, and many rural communities. And we have many tribal communities in our footprint as well. So WGA really is federally focused. We developed bipartisan regional policy, and then we advocate for that at the federal level. So most of our advocacy efforts are federally facing, but we do also convene stakeholders throughout the region on different issues that are important to the West. And that brings me to my next point, which is, we organize our policy priorities and the issues that we engage on in 2 main buckets. We have Western Prosperity Roundtable, which deals a lot with issues of economic and rural development. And then we also have the Working Lands Roundtable, which encompasses all of our natural resource work. And historically, that's been where most of our priorities have lied. That's where we've been able to find a lot of bipartisan support historically. And then from there, we've kind of expanded out, right? Seeing the success that we've had in the natural resource space. What other priorities are important to the West, and how can we kind of have the same success in some of these other areas? So I'll also say that improving the state-federal relationship is a top priority for us. So the reservation of power to the states respects both the differences between regions and people, and also recognizes a right to self-determination at a local level, which we find to be really important, and provides for kind of flexible, more tailored solutions to policy challenges. So one of the biggest things that we advocate for is that the federal government should engage state as partners as opposed to stakeholders, and really consult with them, especially on decisions that would affect the states. So in my policy issue area, I manage our broadband, healthcare, and cybersecurity work, so I can speak to some of our main priorities in that space. I'll say, obviously, as Lauren has pointed out, some of our, on the natural resource side, obviously drought, fire, water management, those are all big issues for us. And then in terms of healthcare, expanding access to healthcare, so through methods like telehealth. I'm currently working on putting together some correspondence to the federal government on how to expand telehealth into the future and keep some of the flexibilities that we've seen during COVID that has allowed for increased access. Social determinants of health, and then mental and behavioral health is a huge one for us as well. So mental health and substance use disorder challenges, which are especially high in Western states. In terms of broadband, increasing speeds and access to broadband, especially on tribal lands, is really big for us, as well as streamlining permitting and improving mapping. And then with cybersecurity, information sharing and protecting our critical infrastructure and election infrastructure, as well as making sure that we have a robust cyber workforce for the 21st century to really address the increased cyber threats that we're seeing. And then again, rural issues and rural development. Obviously, there are many rural communities in the West, and so there are some unique challenges to address there, including breaking down the barriers to federal funding and building up social infrastructure in those areas. On the other side, so we have the association, but we also have a separate entity known as the Western Governors Foundation, which serves to promote the philanthropic efforts of Western states. And our main priorities in that area is the Western Governors Leadership Institute, which convenes a number of young adults. It'll be the first year this year. We're going to have a workshop tacked onto our annual meeting in Coeur d'Alene. And then I also manage a project that we're leading with Americans for the Arts to develop basically an Indigenous cooking series model designed to meet the nutritional needs of Indigenous communities while honoring and embracing their culture and culinary traditions and elevating the voices and skills of Indigenous leaders. So that's been a really great project to work on as well, and definitely with some ties into art in the broader sense, culinary arts. And then in terms, we have one more project under the foundation, and that's the Celebrate the West Arts Competition for high school students, which is currently underway right now. We're voting on the top projects from each state, and then we'll select a first, second, and third winner. So I'll pause there and allow Tim to take it away.
Good morning, everybody. So Western Arts Alliance is a performing arts service organization and a regional convener. So we connect artists or their representatives to performing arts centers primarily around the Western states. And we define the territory as the 12 Western states, similar to WestF. Although we do include Texas in our region, we have members in Houston and especially in West Texas and Austin and so on. But we're primarily focused on the same sort of geographic area as WestF, so from Colorado and west, including Alaska and Hawaii. We really function as a performing arts kind of market. We really help to support the touring and the presenting of artists across the region and even into Canada and to a certain extent in Mexico. We work primarily regionally, but we do have two national programs. First, Advancing Indigenous Performance, which is really about sort of building the capacity of professional Indigenous performing artists to be able to tour and sustain careers across the country, and then also breaking down the barriers to the presentation of Indigenous artists. So we, for example, offer, working with all the regionals across the United States, we offer fee support grants to encourage performing arts centers to engage Indigenous artists. We also have a program called Performing Arts Discovery that we partner with WestF on. And the purpose of that program is really to create opportunities for U.S. artists, especially marginalized artists, BIPOC and LGBTQ+ artists, to tour and build relationships internationally to grow kind of the audience and the demand for their work sort of globally. So that we work again with some of the regionals and with some of the key markets kind of internationally. To create pathways for artists abroad. So that's kind of what we do and how we sort of look at our region. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Timothy. And sharing a little bit about my work, I'm the executive director for Inspire Washington, and we are our state's cultural advocacy organization. Our work is primarily in the realm of coalition building. We aim to unite the broad cultural sector, our nonprofit partners with missions in science, heritage, and the arts, our zoos and our aquariums, our historical societies and museums, historical sites, and the broad array of the arts, as well as not making it be a silo of just nonprofit, but also really being broad and welcoming to everyone that works within the creative industry, our artists, our music bands. How I would describe Washington State is we are a land of unique 39 counties. There are a lot of values that we share that are similar, but we're also, a very diverse and differing topography. We have deserts, we have a rainforest, we have the lush and beautiful Western Washington region that is centered in the Puget Sound. We have a unique and varied history. We were, we were the gateway to the gold rush We are, we saw the rise of commercial airlines right here with Boeing. We also, are a major technical hub. So we've always been a land of innovation and a place that's always had to reinvent itself. We're also a very diverse state and with many diverse communities because of our border to Canada, as well as the connection we have to so many countries overseas and across the Pacific Ocean. And we also have so many of the same issues and values that you all spoke of. We take pride in our beautiful land. We work hard to conserve it. We try to be a welcoming place to all. We have lots of challenges that come along with that. And we're struggling with a lot of the changes we've seen in the West, such as with wildfires and things like that. So I find all the things that you shared really interesting and a lot of great connections there. So let's talk more about regionalism. How do you engage in regional and multi-state issues? And you started sharing that a little bit, but let's take a deeper dive on that. What do you see as the value of thinking as a region, as the Western states?
Well, I'll jump in. I think a really good example in our neck of the woods was when the three Western states, California, Washington, and Oregon, made a pact to kind of share planning around COVID response and policy around COVID and the pandemic. And all of the three states shared a policy of mask wearing for indoor events, gatherings like in performing arts centers. And during the pandemic, the fact that there was consistent policy across those Western states meant that it was easier for performing arts centers to kind of share their policy and explain their policies, and for audiences to understand what they would expect when coming into a venue. And this last year, on March 15th, kind of when the mask mandates were lifted in the three states, it really showed the benefit of that cooperation, because it kind of threw each state and each jurisdiction, each venue into deciding for itself what was the best way forward. How do we best protect our staff, our audiences, our artists? And it was a very challenging period of adjustment. Essentially, everybody was in a position where there was a common policy and everybody sort of knew what the boundaries were to being sort of everybody, on their own. And it was difficult for the artists, it was difficult for the venues and the staff, and it was difficult for audiences to understand. On both sides, that people were done with wearing masks, and then there were people that said, I'm not going into a venue, and artists were saying, I will not perform unless there is vaccine requirements and mask requirements. So there was a lot of, I wouldn't say chaos, but there was a lot of struggle to kind of, to navigate through that after that policy. But that was a really clear and I think an excellent example of regional cooperation and the benefits.
Great example. Thank you.
And I can hop in next. So I would say that regionalism is very key to how the Western Governors Association functions as a whole, right? So at the federal level, particularly since the rise of partisanship across the country that we're seeing in Congress, the governors have really created kind of a collegial environment to engage on many of these issues. And I think a really good example that sort of demonstrates that mindset is we recorded a podcast for the Western Governors Foundation. And the Western Governors Foundation board is comprised of both current and past governors. And we had Governor Dugard, who is the past governor of South Dakota. He was speaking to kind of the neighborly environment in the West. People really have sort of a feeling of, we're in it together, we're neighbors, we can help out our neighbors, despite the fact that we have a big footprint and we are a very diverse region. And then Governor Bullock, who was the former governor of Montana, spoke to the fact that it really is a unique group of leaders in the West that all recognize that really what we share and what we have in common is greater than what might divide us either politically, geographically, or ideologically. So that's sort of the main takeaway, I would say, of how we function as an organization. You know, how can we push these issues that are important forward, and how can we find that common ground between us? And I think that, you know, because we're a federally focused organization, coming at it from a regional perspective really helps us gain kind of collective power when we're advocating for these issues, as opposed to each state going to the federal government separately, which of course they do as well. But we can come from each issue from a regional perspective. And I think that shows a united front, and helps us move forward on some of these really important issues that we wouldn't necessarily get traction on otherwise. And then in terms of cross-cutting issues and how to explore those regional issues within our organization, we use the two roundtables that we organize our work under as the way to explore those issues in a cross-cutting fashion. So one example I'll give is with our broadband work, right? So broadband obviously touches a number of different sectors. It's related to economic development, it's related to workforce development. You know, access to internet is critical infrastructure of the 21st century. And so we need to be thinking about it from all of these different lenses. Then you also have the issue of building it out, right? And how can you co-locate that infrastructure with perhaps energy infrastructure, water infrastructure. So we really need to be thinking about some of these issues in a holistic way.
Thank you, Lauren.
So as I mentioned, the Center for Western Priorities primarily focuses on 8 states in the Rocky Mountain West. Sometimes we have the pleasure of focusing on the West Coast, Oregon, Washington, California, and of course, what federal policymakers are doing in DC. But the thing is, there's only 5 of us currently at the organization, and most of us are based in Denver. So we can't possibly begin to comprehensively cover the different perspectives and lived experiences of the region that we're covering, of the people who live in this part of the United States. So one of the things we do is we rely on periodic polling data to help us understand the attitudes of Westerners around issues related to public lands, clean air, clean water, and other threats facing the region. And I also want to mention that one of the things that distinguishes CWP from other conservation nonprofits is that we're a communications advocacy organization. So our goal is to drive a positive narrative around public lands in the media through various communication channels, including social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and we actually have a full-time social media manager on staff. We also have a podcast. It's called The Landscape. And then, as I mentioned, we rely on original polling, research, and analysis. And none of the work that we do would be possible, none of this advocacy work, without compelling visual media and storytelling capability. Some of our audience and the people we're trying to reach are decision makers at all levels of government, from local to state to federal. And sometimes an artistic or creative approach and telling a compelling narrative is really powerful when it comes to advocating on behalf of these communities and landscapes. So I cannot imagine trying to do our work if people couldn't see the places that we're talking about and hearing from people who love and care for them. So as validation for that commitment, we just recently hired a full-time policy and design associate to ensure that all of our materials have original graphics and that we can complete beautiful layouts for all of our reports.
Thank you. You know, I really identify and find so much of, shared thoughts and feelings, as so many of you shared. Here in Washington State, when I think about regionalism, I can think of it through a number of different views. Like one, there's the Pacific Northwest, our close ties to our immediate neighbors, Oregon and Idaho, and even deeper into Montana. And then of course, there's the coastal states, and with California and Oregon. And, always when I see objectives that are, California objectives or Oregon objectives, there's so often I'm like, gosh, I feel so Washington, or it feels very much like family, like shared minds, shared values, all of those things. And when how would I answer the question, what do I see as the value of regionalism? Well, greater political power, a larger coalition. One example that I shared with some of you earlier was we here in Washington State, in Seattle, Washington, we are the home for the regional archives. And the federal government had planned to move the regional archives. Well, keep in mind that this is, where we have all of the records for our indigenous communities, not just in Washington State, but across the whole Northwest. In fact, Alaska had closed their regional archives, and we collected. And so now we hold all of their records as well. And those records are important. I have a friend of mine, an artist, a member of the Yakama Nation. She was able to research her grandparents by coming down to Seattle. And also, the records that we keep are also the basis of any, legal issues with the American government. So they hold the treaties and things like that. So, so when they wanted to move them to Kansas City, Missouri, or Riverton, California, we could also work as a coalition of states to reach out and say, no, this is important to our region, right? We don't have the time. Indigenous communities will not drive to Riverside, California, or it just creates a huge access barrier. That's just one example. I have 12 wonderful congressional members that represent Washington State, but there's a whole bunch of others that vote too in Congress. And feeling that there are folks with shared values, so that I have partners in different states that we can reach out and say, hey, are you talking to this person? Because I'm talking to my senator. Just makes it feel like, a broader reach and even a broader ground game for achieving our objectives. So now, the West is spoken about in terms of unique demography and geography, particularly the most diverse population in the nation, and in terms of its scale and the presence of public lands and remote communities. How do either of these features of the West inform your work, drive your priorities, inspire you to set objectives?
Well, I think for Western Arts Alliance, we work in a field of performing arts presenting and performing arts centers, which have traditionally been kind of a white audience. And over the last 20 years, performing arts centers and producing, companies, ballet companies and opera companies and symphony orchestras, have seen their communities change dramatically around them, and just in profound ways. And yet the audiences have not sort of kept pace with those demographic changes. And so we see this as a real opportunity to sort of to create more equity in how we serve community, how we define community, how we engage community. For a long time, there was there were concepts of kind of audience developments or cultivating audiences. And I think now our field is shifting more into how we engage community away from thinking of this as an audience. Because I think for a long time, for many performing arts centers, there was a confusion between audience and community. And for many performing arts centers, they would look at their audience and assume it was the community. And I think we're learning now that that is not the case, and there's a lot of ground to cover. This is challenging for many communities, large and small, for many organizations, large and small. But it begins, all of this stuff is a journey. It begins with a step, and we feel like this is the way forward. The pandemic has laid bare some of the challenges in American society with income inequality, sort of climate change, healthcare injustices, racial, systemic racism, and so on. So we now understand, I think we are at a point, an inflection point, where there's an opportunity to make change and sort of navigate through these issues, and to create sort of a more welcoming and encompassing sense of community and belonging.
Thank you for recognizing that audiences aren't community. Yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah, and I think for WGA, speaking from the geographic isolation and remote communities standpoint, a lot of the communities in the West, aren't just isolated geographically. There's also sort of an isolation in terms of access to services. And as Timothy mentioned, the pandemic laid those bare even more clearly, right? So things like access to healthcare, access to the internet, access to many different types of services, arts programming, all of these things. It's much more difficult. People don't necessarily have the same level of access to these things as they do in other areas. And that's one area that we focus on a lot is, how can we ensure that these places aren't isolated socially, and when we're thinking of access to services. And one area that I'll mention specifically is our Western Prosperity Roundtable. We just held a forum last week, actually, in Oklahoma City. And we were looking specifically at federal funding and all of the federal funding that's coming down both through COVID and also the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And the fact that historically, a lot of these communities haven't gotten to access the same levels of funding as other areas have, potentially due to things like capacity constraints, so not having enough workforce. We heard a lot that in rural communities, there might be one person doing 3 different jobs, right? They're not just focused on one thing. They are kind of an architect of multiple things for their community, and that's just because there's just not as many people to fill in those jobs. So a lot of people that don't have the same level of experience with applying for federal grants. And then how do we break down those barriers at the federal level? How do we meet people where they're at, so that they can access the same levels of resources, and invest in infrastructure the way that other areas are able to and have been able to leverage the funding streams that have come down? And how do we ensure that the underserved areas and the unserved areas are truly the ones that are getting that funding, and are able to put that to use? So that's a really big focus for us. I'll also say with my work with the Western Governors Foundation and our Arts and Healthy Living project, which is the project we're leading in partnership with Americans for the Arts, one of the big things is, because of the diversity of the region and because of the fact that, we have such a broad geographic range, is that people that are in communities that are being served need to be the ones that are involved in solutions for their own communities, right? So we have a tribal project. We're working with 4 groups throughout the West. And the biggest thing that they've told us is, there are similarities between tribal communities, but each has their own really strong entrenched cultures and traditions. And you're not going to have, say, a one-size-fits-all approach to something like nutrition education, or food skills education and programming. So when we're designing things like programs, we need to make sure that it's informed by the communities that we're serving. And there are going to be general takeaways that we can use as sort of a framework or a model for that type of work. But really the specifics need to come from those areas. And they need to be really involved in the programming that's going to be in that area.
So there's some really important work going on among conservation nonprofits and environmental organizations in terms of a reckoning with the fact that some of these landscapes and national parks that we tend to celebrate for their remoteness, for their beauty, some of what, in many cases, what led to those places was a forced removal of, and sometimes violent removal of, people who trace their lineage to that area for millennia. So that's something that has to be part of our work, is considering who came here before and how can we, better yet, how can we use our tools and resources, our communication platforms to elevate voices that are different than our own. And that applies not just to Indigenous communities, but there are some significant challenges with environmental injustice issues in the Western United States as well. That was something that, like many things, came to the surface in a way that could not be ignored due to the COVID-19 pandemic, in terms of looking at where people are more likely to have asthma or bad air quality, things like that. So just in terms of trying to take a more comprehensive approach to the different demographics in our region, that's something that we're continuing to ask ourselves all the time, is who should be leading on this? Who should be speaking to this issue, and how can we use our resources to support that? So I'll give an example of some work that we've been doing recently. We have a campaign right now. It's called the Road to 30 Postcards campaign. And this is an example of how much our work relies on compelling visual storytelling and narrative. So folks may be aware that shortly after being sworn into office, President Biden signed an executive order calling for the protection of 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030, which, if it sounds ambitious, it's because it is. But there are some important scientific underpinnings for that urgency and for that level of ambition. And one of the things that we thought is, we need something to make this big, amorphous conservation goal more personal and more real. What would that look like in communities across the country? So that's why we launched the Postcards campaign, which is really a shift from a regional to a local focus for us in some ways, by focusing on individual people living in communities that are most affected by public lands decisions. So it's a multimedia campaign. It goes across all our different platforms, our podcast, interactive blogs, ArcGIS supported story maps, and then probably most significantly, we produced 5 short documentary style films. We hired a cinematographer out of LA who had some drone experience. It was a bit of a shoestring operation. I was, on the one hand, holding a light bounce and also interviewing people and adjusting sound and positioning as needed. But we're really proud of these 5 films. And I understand there might be an opportunity to see one of those this morning that focuses on the effort to establish Bears Ears National Monument in Utah, which, talking about building coalitions and a regional approach, that was a historic thing, that 5 distinct tribal nations came together in order to protect that area. And obviously it's been an up and down process after the Trump administration rescinded the boundaries to Biden restoring the original boundaries of that area. But that's an example for us where we would love to talk about Bears Ears. We want that story to be told. We were not the ones individually to tell it. It was important to provide a vehicle so that the people we featured in the film could talk about it in their own words.
Thank you, Lauren. Washington State is especially here in the Central Puget Sound, is incredibly diverse, and the diversity is spreading. So here we are within our borders. We have 42 tribes and indigenous communities, only 35 of which are federally recognized. And throughout our history, every decade has really been marked by a different, has seen a different focus on a different group that's immigrated here. For example, my parents came in the late 60s during a time of significant Filipino American immigration. We had there's been the Southeast Asian wave of immigration that happened here, as well as East African, and then there's always different things that really drive immigration, such as the agricultural needs of Central Washington, which has brought a lot of Mexican communities over there for that work. The rise of Microsoft in the suburban communities around, the Microsoft campus. There's now a tremendous and large Indian American population and Chinese American population for the people that came here to work in that industry. So. And I think so that was kind of just new communities coming to Washington State was kind of stage one. And now what we see, housing affordability, has seen the shift of where people now live. At the time, when I was growing up, Seattle had the most diverse population in King County. We had the largest African American and Black community. We had the largest Asian American community, but now that's not the case. Many of those communities are moving south, and now they're even starting to move out of the county further south, where homes are more affordable. So for us in our work, championing cultural programming, we believe that cultural programming provides tremendous value, and therefore communities' access to them is really critical to us. What kind of cultural infrastructure do they have? Do they have a place to celebrate, to perform, to create, where their children can sing? Do they have all those spaces? We certainly don't want to be a community where only in the city of Seattle, in these city limits, people have access as our population gets less diverse. So that's really how we approach that. And we also recognize that throughout our rural and remote areas, that communities don't often have the same access to the arts. And that if young people grow up there and they love to sing or dance or do theater, that they should be able, and they love their home, they should be able to stay where they live, and not have to move to the Seattle area or to other urban cities. Next, let's talk about where the common opportunities are. I mean, so much already our conversation is starting to steer towards the areas where our work really intersect, and we're not so different, right? What common opportunities, trends, or challenges do you see in the West? Common themes that seem to appear across the region include engaging Indigenous communities, resource management, natural and cultural environmentalism, and conversations about the urban-rural divide. But not limited to that. Where are we doing similar, if not the same work in our work here in the West? Who'd like to take that question? One thing I'll add, because I was just talking about this yesterday in a forum that we held with some of our partners in the north part of our county. I find myself in advocacy. Often I'm pitted against something. I'm coming to talk about resources that we need from state government or federal government for arts and culture. And often I have to hear the list of other things that are very important. And before I used to take that bait, and I don't know why it took me a little while to recognize we are those people. Artists are the people looking for affordable housing, right? Artists have children and they want their kids to have great education and good schools, right? I know that I'm really inspired by hearing about all the things that you're all doing to promote conservation. We here in King County will be voting in November to preserve 65,000 more acres of forests in King County, because that's really important to us. And we know it's a critical step we have to do as part of the West, where where climate migration is becoming a real thing. People, we used to kind of joke about all the people that moved here from California for a more quieter way of life, and now they're coming here for other reasons, to escape fire and drought, right? So these things, matter to the cultural sector as well, because we are, they're going to be our neighbors, and we want all of those same important things. What other things do you see as kind of being inherent?
I think that we're all approaching this conversation from maybe different areas, and yet at the same time, I think it's fair to say people love the West. They love living here. And one of the things that we've seen in our polling that maybe others have seen as well is the importance of access to the outdoors, safe, equitable access. We did some polling in summer 2020 asking people, how much have you visited public lands in the last month or in the last year? How does that compare to before? So that, I think, is something that has really come through for us, and that may cut across any number of constituencies as well. Just the importance of loving this place and wanting to appreciate it and enjoy it.
And I can jump in. I think those are great points, Lauren. I also think, and this is something that I've really come to realize through our work with Americans for the Arts, is how broad the arts can be, right? So it can really play into so many different sectors. Lauren touched on this a little bit earlier, but storytelling is a key way that a lot of us do our work, including our advocacy work, right? So elevating individual stories, but then also coupling that with data and broader regional trends is such an important part of policy making and trying to influence decisions at both the regional and the federal level. So I think all of those areas are ways that we can see some of these issues kind of convene. I'll also note, we had our chair initiative a few years ago when Governor Burgum, governor of North Dakota, was the chair of the association. And we had a Reimagining the Rural West initiative. And so we talked a lot about placemaking and how to get people to move to rural communities, stay in rural communities, make those communities their own. And placemaking has a lot of ties into the arts and culture, and also kind of plays into what a number of us have touched upon with access to services and access to things like the arts and cultural events. So all of those things are really important. And I think bringing anything into those rural communities helps then with other areas. So I've spoken about broadband a number of times, but access to the internet, gives us access to any number of virtual events. Obviously, there have been a big rise in the number of virtual events that we've had, especially with COVID, but also just, within our communities and placemaking and things like that. And I agree. I think, a lot of issues that we face, there's similar approaches to solving them, right? We touched on regionalism a little bit, and coming together really to advance our common priorities. So we can see that throughout all of the different sectors that we're each working in.
Yeah, just to build on what Lauren was just saying, I think that one of the things that the pandemic has accelerated is this shift to remote work. And, I think the office and the concept of an office and the workplace has changed dramatically in the last couple of days, where folks can work anywhere. And, I think one of the qualities of the West that is common across all the states is that you have these kind of concentrated urban centers where people have gathered for access to kind of employment, better jobs, education, centers of education, and the arts, and all of this infrastructure that draws people together in urban centers. And as the workplace shifts and people can work remotely, they can move in pursuit of better quality of life, outdoor recreation, being closer to sort of to nature, more affordable housing, and so on. And I think that building this infrastructure so that that there's better infrastructure and quality of life kind of issues across the region will help sort of grow and sustain sort of rural communities and shift kind of that pendulum from sort of urban concentration to sort of a greater kind of I don't know that it will be sort of more equally spread, but I think there's opportunities to shift from that urban concentration into something more rural and creating access to jobs and education and the arts, across the region, not just in sort of privileged centers in our region.
Actually, absolutely, I agree with that. While at the same time, I've also heard feedback from a lot of our partners in more rural parts of the state that also remote work also fueled a bit of gentrification as well. That rural communities then found themselves competing with folks moving in their communities who had maybe deeper pockets to buy that neighbor farm. So there's absolutely there, as with everything we've seen before, opportunities also come with its own unique challenges, but still, but it's still an opportunity for progress for sure. One thing that we are always trying to find a path forward with here in Washington State is how do we develop objectives that are important and resonate with our partners in our cities along the I-5 corridor, as well as with our partners that are in more remote areas of the state. And there's a lot of, Washington has that urban-rural dynamic, right? There's different politics, there's different communities, there's just a different approach to things, right? We, of course, always try to focus on what really unites us and where are we the same? We want quality experiences. We want, quality cultural experiences, good education for our kids. But I'm curious as to how with all of you, with your policies and that you're pursuing, or the objectives you create, or the coalition you build, how do you spur that kind of, that collaboration, and how do you, or what kind of strategies do you have to bring different voices to the table that are often not there? I've certainly learned in our state work. I mean, if we're going to pursue an objective in our state government, I mean, it certainly can't be because Seattle shows up and we didn't invite anyone else to the table, right? That it really has to be about Spokane and Whatcom, Okanagan County, that all of these communities, of course, are important, and there's a shared objective there that we can pursue. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks, Manny. I would say that, we're constantly thinking when we're holding work sessions or meetings, how can we have both the diverse representation in the room and on our panels? So that's one way, right? We need to make sure that we have across issues, private sector, public sector, urban, rural representation, so that we can really dig into the crux of some of these issues. I also think that some challenges are going to be unique, whether you're in an urban area or you're in a rural area. And it's important sometimes to call out when they are unique and when they might need different solutions to fix issues. One thing I'm thinking of is broadband, right? So again, just with the terrain and the vast distances, it's more difficult to run fiber to every household. But fiber is, you get high speeds with fiber, but it is much more expensive. So when we're thinking of structuring federal programs, how can we ensure that those communities aren't left out of the equation, right? How do we ensure that they get the support that they need to build out to those areas, so that they're not just left behind? And then in the most remote areas, that are, just there's such a low population. It's going to be, an exorbitant cost to, say, build fiber to the home. Are there any other solutions that we can look at there to bring connectivity to those areas? And how can we approach that issue? I think a lot of times we focus on how urban and rural are so different, and I do think that there are circumstances, as I'm saying, where you need to kind of focus on each individually and have solutions tailored to each. But with the trends that we've seen over the pandemic as well, we're seeing a lot of kind of what's thought of urban problems in more rural areas. We have a huge housing crisis, which a number of you guys have talked about. People being priced out of communities, especially in places like resort towns, where you have a large disparity between the workers and then people that are coming in to live in the resort towns and use those kind of amenities and those features that aren't working there. And so are there any places where we can take anything that we've learned from more rural areas and apply them to, or more urban areas and apply them to, what we're seeing kind of coming about with these new trends? So I think it's important to look at the issue from both of those perspectives, both the similarities, but then also where do we need to actually pull out the unique solutions? And then just making sure that you have the representation at the table whenever you're doing whatever you're doing, right? So whether it's having a meeting or a work session or calls, making sure that you're getting feedback and input on these policies from a variety of communities and perspectives.
Yeah. On the positive note, I want to sort of concur with Lauren on that point, and then sort of what she was talking about earlier is kind of designing and building programs from the ground up. So being in relationship, in community, and building those initiatives from community up rather than kind of imposing anything, I think will do a lot to sort of knitting kind of and addressing some of these challenging issues. However, I also believe that some of the larger, most difficult challenges we face in knitting communities together are kind of macro issues. And I'm talking about sort of the threat to democracy and election integrity, and sort of how our political systems of gerrymandering and apportionment sort of are driving division in communities. So we have to address these larger macro issues to be able to get in and address these issues of climate change and healthcare injustice and systemic racism. All of these things have to be addressed. And then frankly, I think sort of the issues of disinformation and social media that we all use to tell our stories, social media itself is a real challenge. And unless we can address kind of the real dangers in social media, everything is at stake. And I just want to say, and I'll get off my high horse here, but after the 2016 election, I quit all social media because I did not want to be. I could clearly see what was happening in American society and didn't want to be a part of that. Now, there's many benefits to it, but I think we have to address these larger issues of kind of disinformation, that sort of the difficulties or the weaknesses or the the evils, if you will, of social media, and the threats to democracy, of ensuring that our elections and that the American public, no matter what party you belong to, sort of can feel trust in the electoral processes in their communities, in their school boards, and their state legislatures, and at the federal level. So that's my my take on that.
It's pretty interesting to be in the nonprofit sector, because we're not in the business of being the decision makers. That's not our role. And I will say that there are times where I feel frustrated, and I feel like we're all banging pots and pans on the sidelines and wanting to be heard. And as Manny mentioned, as much as I have a deep love and commitment to the issues I work on, there are many other challenges that are facing this region. So how do you elevate your own issues in relation to other pressing needs? So really, we have to look at the tools we have, and some of that is numbers and engaging people across the country. And as a communications organization, that's one of the best things that we can do. We can use our reach on social media platforms and among our contacts in the administration and decision makers at different levels to, in some regards, shine a spotlight on what's happening across the country. And that's not something that we would know about if we weren't asking people all the time in different conservation organizations and our partners and other stakeholders and local elected officials we work with. What's going on in your area? What's an issue that could use some greater attention? And so, as Manny mentioned in the question, how do you move things forward? Well, in some cases, efforts have been underway for decades. We made a film in El Paso, Texas, about the Kastner Range. It's a former Army missile range that abuts the city. It's right next to the Franklin Mountain Range, Franklin Mountain State Park. It's about 7,000 acres, and there's development pressure on all sides of it. And it's public land, but it's not open to the public because of unexploded ordnance that are still there. And it would be a game changer to have that kind of green space access in the El Paso community. It's one of the largest urban areas in the country. And it's also binational because it's right there next to Ciudad Juarez. So when we went to talk to some folks about Kastner Range, we learned that they've been working on this for 50 years. And so it felt good as a conservation nonprofit communications organization to make a film. It was almost like an in-kind donation, and then the folks, the volunteers and advocates on the ground can take that and use it in any communications that they have, as well as the B-roll. We gave them the background imagery that we shot for use in other materials. So it's a combination of building power, building numbers, and listening, and doing what you can to support efforts already underway.
Thank you. Well, at this time, we are going to be opening up to questions from our audience, our community. So if you can throw it in the chat. And I may need a little help from West staff because I don't know that since I had to shift to my phone that I can see that box.
Hi, Manny. I'm here to support you. My name is Cameron Green. I am the executive coordinator for West staff. My pronouns are he, him, his. I am a Cambodian American with glasses and short black hair. I'm joining today from Aurora, Colorado. And these are the ancestral lands of the Apaches, Utes, Cheyennes, Comanches, and Arapaho. So, I do have while we're waiting for questions to come into the Q&A, you can stick them into the Q&A on the sidebar or in the chat, and we'll see them. But while we're waiting for the questions to come in, let's just go ahead and show the Bear Ears video. I think this is a great opportunity to do that. And we have a few questions, I think, in the bonus round that relate to that question.
My name is Regina Lopez White Skunk. I'm a former elected official for the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe. I'm also a former co-chair of the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition. What I feel when I come out here is like I come home. There's a connection. It's like I come to visit a relative.
name is Vaughn Haydenfeld. I live in Bluff, Utah. My organization, Friends of Cedar Mesa, we worked hand in hand with local folks here trying to see what we could do to create a preservation of this region.
When the tribal leaders came together, one of the visions that we had was that this could serve as a model for other Indigenous-led endeavors to protect sacred sites and landscapes. My great-grandfather was one of our late medicine men for the Ute Mountain people, the Weemanooch Band, and this is the area that he did a lot of his gathering.
We have more cultural resources, more archaeological sites in this region than probably any other place in the United States.
When the monument was reduced 85% by President Trump, I was heartbroken, and I still feel very emotional when I speak about this because of how much I tried to elevate the voices of my people. When people come through and destroy it, they take away knowledge, they take away information, and it will never come back again.
I look at a lot of these sites now that in 40 years I've been here, some of them look like someone came with a vacuum cleaner and just removed everything. It's an incredible outdoor museum, and we should treat it as such, as a museum.
I am a grandmother of 12 grandchildren. 6 of them reside here in San Juan County with their backyard facing to the Bears Ears landscape. They need to inherit the same opportunities that we had to share and experience places like Bears Ears in and around where our people historically have gathered and lived and celebrated and cried.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you, Lauren Bogart, for sharing that great video with the group. And while we're still waiting for some questions, I'm just going to ask some of the questions from the bonus round because I think they really do relate well to this video. You know, the Western U.S. is a very unique space in terms of the way that the land is divided between public and private land. And so I'm curious, how are public lands, whether they be, you know, lands for leisure, lands for business, or lands for government, unique cultural assets and natural resources important to the West?
One thing we can say is that public lands are part of what defined the Western United States. We have a lot more space here, and it's not as common to have some of these large landscapes that we talk about, like, for example, in Bears Ears National Monument in the northeastern and southeastern part of the United States. So that's one thing that separates it. And then there are different types of public lands, right? They're and different activities are allowed in different places. And just looking at the Bureau of Land Management as an example, there's a multiple use mandate. So there's a challenge of balancing extractive uses as well as recreation and wilderness and wildlife habitat. I'd love to hear what Lauren Cloward has to say about this as well, representing the WGA.
Yeah, I think, you know, I I don't manage our natural resource work, but it is so critical to what we do, right? There are many unique challenges that we face because of that. We also have to work more closely with the federal government because of the fact that there are so many federal lands. We're constantly working across jurisdictions, both states, federal, and tribal communities, seeing as a lot of tribal land is focused in the West as well. So we come at it from that perspective. But if I'm looking at it from sort of more of the economic development and side of things and socioeconomic side of things, it really is a huge draw, right? I mean, it's the reason why so many people live here. It's the reason why so many people choose to move here or have moved to more suburban or rural communities, especially during the pandemic. And we see both the strain that puts on certain communities. I mean, I know in Utah, especially at Moab, I mean, they were seeing insane amounts of visitors during COVID. And it's great that so many people are interested in outdoor recreation and enjoying these incredible natural features that we have and that I think make us proud to live where we do, right? But that does come with some unique challenges as well, right? For those gateway communities and how to manage those crowds and how to ensure that, you know, we're protecting that land, but also allowing people to use it. So I think that's a big one that we're thinking about a lot. And again, bringing it back to the housing portion, with everyone coming in, we need to make sure that workers and federal workers too, who a lot of times are kind of priced out of those areas or there aren't places for them to live, are able to be in those communities. So those are all things to think about as we move forward.
I think one of the points that was made in the video is that these public lands and these parks are real treasures. You know, this idea of public land as a museum and this space and Bears Ears as a museum. And I think that's a really appropriate way to think about kind of these lands as treasures that need to be protected and ensured that they're there for future generations. And I think one of the things that we're starting to see is that federal agencies like the National Park Service and the Bureau of Land Management, I think are beginning to understand that they need to engage at a kind of a local level as well in helping to tell the story and engage with Indigenous people in telling those stories and sort of working cooperatively. And I think that's a positive shift. For example, we have one of our native launchpad artists, Delbert Anderson, who's a Diné or Navajo jazz and hip hop trumpet player out of New Mexico. And Delbert is now an artist in residence on BLM land. So he can go into sort of land, work and compose and then perform. So this, you know, he's commissioned by the BLM to sort of be there, to create work, to reflect on the environment and sort of tell that story from his perspective, not from the agency's perspective, but from Delbert's own personal experience. And I think that's a really great way to kind of reinforce and build kind of sort of engagement and build a relationship between the public very broadly and these parks.
I think this conversation is a really great example of how arts and cultural work is sometimes the how we get somewhere and not the what we're trying to do, right? Arts and it's arts and cultural work. It's museum, it's storytelling, it's interpretive centers. The cultural sector tells stories, and this is how we are a great partner in conservation and things. We are the interpretive panels at the side of the road to tell you how the story of how this place came to be and why it's important. We are creating these videos. So it's one thing I'm really proud about our work. Having been a heritage specialist that worked in a museum, we often told stories about place and really through artistry and storytelling really made the history of some place come alive. So just shows how we're all working together.
Yeah, and I think one of the great things about the video, it as Manny said, it helps us understand how something was done, how Bears Monument kind of comes to be, and it leads to the final bonus question of we always talk about what we do to assist Indigenous communities, but I'm also interested in that how question too. So how do you uniquely address the needs of Indigenous communities and rural, remote, and frontier communities in your work?
Well, I think fundamentally it starts with being in relationship to community. And I think for many Western communities and predominantly white organizations, and I don't know that many folks really have authentic, substantial, trust-based relationships with communities. And I think it begins there. You have to be listening, and you have to be engaged in conversation sort of at that level. And from there you can build trust, you can build cooperation and partnership, but it begins with that fundamental need of being in relation to Indigenous communities and leaders and artists and culture bearers. Begins there.
That's a really good question, and I think it's one that, especially with WGA, we're constantly trying to think through, right? Because tribes and tribal lands exist within state borders where, before it used to be all tribal land, right? So we have this interesting dichotomy of borders and tribal nations, which have to work with states because they're found, within and across their borders. But technically, they usually work with the federal government on a nation-to-nation level. So there is a really interesting dynamic there. But a lot of these issues affect tribal communities, right? And I think the way that we try to go about it is, we started up sort of a tribal liaison with basically the people who are in charge of tribal work at the state level. And some of the issues that we've engaged on there is the MMIP crisis, which is missing and murdered Indigenous persons, but really allowing the work that we're doing kind of being driven by those liaisons, as opposed to coming with them with, say, the governor's priorities or something else. So I think that's really huge. With our foundation work, it's listening, it's having knowledge exchanges, it's making sure that we're not centering ourselves. We're really hearing what other communities are saying to us and are elevating. And then on some of these issues, it's engaging with the federal government and their work in tribal communities and doing our part to address those issues and increase access to those communities. If we're looking at rural communities and ensuring that they have access to resources and funding and all of those other things, tribal communities are an obvious part of that, right? Because many of them, not all of them, but many of them are in remote locations, and many of them are unserved or underserved like some of our other rural communities.
I know we're running short on time, so I'll just share one brief example. One of the things we have to do is first educate ourselves. And one of the ways you can do that is through listening and being open to acknowledging and rectifying where we fall short. Unfortunately, we all have blind spots. And something that came to our attention just recently, our podcast was previously called Go West Young Podcast, which was a play on the Go West Young Man. I think it was maybe Horace Greeley. And we were about to do a live podcast event in New Mexico. And the Governor Lujan Grisham's tribal engagement officer said to me, "We really don't like the name of your podcast. The legacy of Manifest Destiny in New Mexico is alive and well." And while we managed to still include the land commissioner, Stephanie Garcia Richard, in the podcast, invited her to talk about that legacy, it put a thought in our minds that we needed to take a look at this. So we invited 2 scholars of Native American history, one at CU Boulder and one at Harvard, to come on our podcast where we announced that we were changing the name to The Landscape. So that's just an example of listening and seeing where, when you know better, you can do better.
You know, at Inspire Washington, we have really had to look at how things were done with the organizations that were merged prior that became Inspire Washington. For example, and also to figure out how we want to move forward. And we host an annual conference. And in our first year in hosting the conference, you know, we didn't pick a location that had, you know, we didn't pick a location based off of hotel rooms or resort amenities or anything like that. We picked a location in the state because there was a tribe that we wanted to partner with. We intentionally created a track of programming that was really an opportunity for the community, you know, for the Yakama Nation to convene and decide what was the right conversations that they wanted to have. We didn't just acknowledge the land. We spent a lot of time talking about what the conference was and what it could be together. And we waited for an invitation for us to be able to gather within their land. And then we actually hosted it within the ceded territory of the Yakama Nation. Which made the acknowledgement of the place really different, because it wasn't, you know, when we acknowledge land in downtown Seattle, you're actually looking at a window of, yes, we are still within the historical lands of the Duwamish, but you're looking at skyscrapers. It's a very different view when you're within the ceded territory and you're surrounded by, you know, you're embedded in their community. So we're still exploring what this means. We also know that their objectives are our objective, their cultural objectives, the importance of tribal sovereignty, which is heritage for Washington State. You know, the making sure that curriculum is within every school, which is a mandate of the state, but is not actually being implemented. And so therefore that becomes a cultural objective of ours. And these are just steps. You know, we still have a lot of more work to do that we're still exploring today.
I want to thank everyone for coming to today's session. And I especially want to thank our panelists for providing us insights into the discourse on arts policy, especially in the West, and the regional trends and the things that we're seeing in this diverse region. So again, on behalf of West Staff, I want to thank the panelists for joining us today. And I want to thank everyone who joined us in the session to listen to what the panelists have to say, and just our greatest gratitude for them for the work that they do. We'll be back in just in a few moments. I'm not really sure how much difference there is between here and the next session, but I want to thank everyone again, and we'll see you back on soon.
Right.
Thanks.